Hello, gentlemen. Today what we're going to do is we're going to begin our look at exercise 3D, where we're going to talk about something called seasonal indices. And singular, this would be a seasonal index. Indices is simply the plural for index. So when you're thinking about these, remember that if you have one of them, it's an index. If you have more than one, it's going to be they're going to be indices. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a number. So this is simply a number that will allow you to compare different seasons. Right? And so what happens here is it takes out the variation. So when you have a seasonal graph, we know that a graph is seasonal because it keeps doing the same thing over and over in a particular pattern, right? And then repeats. Okay? So remember we talked about seasonality when we were looking at graphs. So what we want to do is we want to calm this line down and see what's happening from season to season. And one way of doing that is by doing what's called a seasonal index. Now we'll learn how to calculate them, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what they mean and some key facts or some things that they have to have. Okay. 2 rules, okay, that you must pay attention to when you're working with these. First thing is that it's calculated so that, first rule, it is an average of 1 or 100%. Remember that 1 and 100% mean the same thing. Now that doesn't mean it can't be a number bigger than 1 or less than 1, but we're averaging as 1. So that means that in a typical season, it should be 1. Now, if it's above 1 or below 1, that tells you that that's not a typical season, okay? If above 1, it's higher than typical. Now again, these are hypothetical, so just deal with the fact that it's going to be higher. If below 1, then it's lower than typical. Now remember, we'll do examples of these in class together, so don't panic. You just need to remember that it's an average of 1, right? And therefore, if it's higher than 1, if it's above 1, that means you have a higher seasonal index. There's something happening that's causing it to be increased. Or if it's below 1, then it's lower than the typical season. Okay? So keep in mind that number of 1. All right. The next thing, the second rule, is that they should add to the number of seasons. Now again, remember we're going to do some examples, but say you're doing quarterly. Quarterly means 4, so that means they should all add up to make 4. All right? Because some of them are going to be above 1, some below 1, but if you add them up, they should add up to make a 4. If they were monthly, then that means they should all add up to make 12. So you can check to see that you have the right figures if you just add them all up and they equal to the number of seasons. And again, we're going to do plenty of examples of that, so don't panic if that's not making sense to you. Right now, I want you just to focus on the ideas. Okay? Now, to learn how to use them, we're going to use a little bit of deseasonalizing. Now that's a fun one. And so we're going to just give you a couple of formulas. And again, don't worry about it. We're going to learn how to use them. But if you're going to deseasonalize data, so we're going to be deseasonalizing it. In other words, we're going to be taking the seasonal variations out. Okay? And there's a formula for that. The deseasonalized, and I know this language, these words, deseasonalized figure is found by taking the actual figure, so the number that you get from just reading the chart, the actual figure, and dividing it by the seasonal index. Now, in the beginning, they're going to just give you a seasonal index and tell you, and an actual figure, and you're just going to do the math. In a moment, though, we're going to learn how to find that seasonal index from raw data. Okay? We'll do examples of both. Now, if you want to go backwards and re-seasonalize, because you know in math, if you do it one way, you're going to have to end up doing it back the other way. Re-seasonalize the data. There's a formula for that, and if you remember your basic algebra, it's always just the opposite. You're going to take the actual figure. That's what you're looking for this time, right? Because we know the deseasonalized figure. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do the opposite, and that is simply the deseasonalized figure times the seasonal index. Right? We got the number by dividing it, so the opposite of divide is to multiply. So to find the actual figure, instead of dividing it by something, we'll multiply. Okay? Now, you need to know these two formulas to be able to go back and forth, right? So practice with those a little bit to go back and forth. All right. Now, that's how to use the data to answer questions. We're looking for the actual figures, and that's when they're going to give you your own seasonal data. And you're going to see what happens is when you're doing that, it's going to give you a new line that you can then use to determine a trend. So we'll look at some pictures of that. So say, for example, you had something that was doing this, right? Looks like a trend. There's something going on here. But if you drew a trend line for this, just using your eye, you might say that trend is that it's going down. But because of the seasonality, it's very difficult to be able to say if that trend line is actually going down. If, however, you deseasonalize the data, you see that you're going to get a line that is much flatter, okay? And from there, you can see, in this particular example, what I really wanted you to see is that it actually ended up going up the trend line. So if you drew it from the deseasonalized data, you would see that this line is actually going up. So you need to be able to, just like when we smooth those curves, this is a way of taking all of that seasonality, that up and down movement out of the equation, so that you can then make better comparisons. Okay, so that's what we're going to be using it for. Now, we need to be able to calculate the seasonal indices, and that's really easy to do. We're just calculating a ratio, so we're just going to be using some divisions. So let's talk about how to do that. To calculate, and you don't have to memorize all of these, but you need to know how they work. Seasonal indices. There are two methods. Well, not one method, but two different ideas. If it's for 1 year's data, you only have 1 year's data, then it's a one-step process. Okay? The seasonal index is simply found by taking the value for the season and then dividing that by the seasonal average. Now again, an average is just a mean, right? You're just dividing it. Okay? So let's do some steps. Okay? So, and it depends on if you're doing quarters or months or however your data is presented. So make sure you see how many periods or how many seasons that you have. If there are 4 given, like summer, autumn, winter, and spring, that's 4. Keep that in mind because that's going to give you the number to divide by. So make sure that if you're doing quarterly, then do it quarterly, okay? So your first step, determine the number of seasons, right? Because that's going to give you the number that you have to divide by to get the average that you need, okay? Second, find the quarterly average for the year. Now, to do that, it's just an average. So remember, that just means find the sum of the numbers and divide by 4 or the number of quarters. And in this case, we were doing 4, but so the number of quarters, or the number of seasons, I'm sorry. Okay, so that gives you your quarterly average. It's just a regular old average, okay? Then, third and final step, guys, so it's pretty easy for calculating it anyway, is you're simply going to divide out, do the value for each season. So the seasonal index, it's this formula here, is simply the value for each season divided by the seasonal average. And I should call that seasonal, not quarterly. Sorry, seasonal average. Because it could be more than one. It's usually quarters because seasons we think of as 4 seasons in a year, but it could be monthly seasons or something like that. So just put seasonal average instead. Okay? Now, and again, we'll look at examples of how these work so that you can get a clear picture when we're in class. Next thing is they should add to the number of seasons. So if you had 4 seasons, they should add to 4. But remember that rounding errors when you do the division could give you slightly less or slightly more. Okay? And what you're going to do is you're always going to write as a table. And again, we'll look at what the table looks like and talk about how to build the table, but it's just a table depending on, so we'll look at just if you had quarterly, if this is summer, this is autumn, this is winter, and this is spring, then you would get values for each season. Okay? Now, if you have more than 1 year of data, then the process is a little more complicated, but it's really just a repeat of what you've done, but you have to do it for each season. So we'll look at that one next time. Right now, we'll just look at these, and then we'll come back to the others and spend some more time on this. All right, see you in class.